Captain J. Zeamer Jr. stood outside the operations tent at Port Moresby, watching bomber crews receive their mission assignments. 5th Air Force, Southwest Pacific Theater, March 1943. For the third time that week, every squadron commander on the field had turned him down. Too aggressive, too reckless. Makes unauthorized modifications to aircraft. The list of complaints was long and consistent. Zeamer was 24 years old, a highly skilled B-17 pilot with exceptional navigation abilities and a photographic memory for terrain. But those qualifications meant nothing when every commanding officer considered him a liability. Regular crews didn't want him. He couldn't get assigned to a bomber. And in the brutal air war over the Southwest Pacific, where Japanese fighters killed bomber crews daily, being grounded was a humiliation that cut deep. But what frustrated squadron commanders about Zeamer's approach to flying would prove to be exactly what was needed when 17 Japanese Zeros attacked a lone bomber over Bougainville. The tactics they called reckless, the modifications they prohibited, the aggressive flying they condemned. All of it would matter during 40 minutes of combat, so intense that every single man aboard would be wounded. The question wasn't whether Zeamer was too reckless to fly. The question was whether any pilot who wasn't reckless could survive what was coming. Zeamer's problems with military authority had followed him since training. He questioned doctrine, suggested modifications without authorization, and had opinions about everything delivered with the confidence of someone who was usually correct. His superiors recognized two contradictory truths. He was an exceptional pilot with supernatural navigation skills, but he was absolutely insufferable to command. When Zeamer arrived in the Southwest Pacific in late 1942, 5th Air Force bomber groups were being slaughtered. Japanese fighters ambushed American bombers regularly. Squadron commanders needed pilots who would follow orders precisely and maintain formation discipline. Zeamer wanted to fly alone at low altitude, taking photographs. Exactly the kind of mission that got reconnaissance pilots killed. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the B-17 missions over the Pacific. Comment below and let me know if you'd heard about J. Zeamer before. By April 1943, Zeamer had been at Port Moresby for months without a permanent crew assignment. That's when he made a decision that would define everything that followed. If no squadron would give him a crew, he'd build his own. And if no commanding officer would assign him a functional aircraft, he'd take one nobody else wanted. The crew Zeamer assembled was a collection of men that other aircraft commanders had rejected. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski, too aggressive. Gunner George Kendrick, discipline problems. Navigator Ruby Johnston, skilled but abrasive. Each man had been told they didn't fit. They were exactly what Zeamer wanted. The aircraft was almost as rejected as the crew. B-17E serial number 41-2666, nicknamed Old 666. Shot up badly on multiple missions, patched together with salvaged parts, scheduled for scrapping, Zeamer saw opportunity. If it was headed for salvage anyway, nobody would stop him from modifying it. Over several weeks, the crew transformed Old 666 into something that violated multiple regulations. They installed additional machine guns, far more than standard B-17 armament, reinforced the nose compartment. Added ammunition capacity. The result was a bomber that could defend itself like a fighter. Squadron commanders noticed but didn't intervene. The attitude was simple. Let the misfits have their broken airplane. When they get themselves killed, at least it won't be in an aircraft we need. By June 1943, Zeamer's crew had developed a reputation for bringing back intelligence when other crews couldn't reach the targets. On June 16, 1943, Fifth Air Force needed photographs of Bougainville Island. The Japanese were suspected of building airfields there, but cloud cover and distance made the target difficult. Intelligence assessed Japanese fighter presence as minimal. Routine reconnaissance, photographed the coastline, returned to base. Expected enemy contact, none. Ziemer studied the maps and didn't believe it. If the Japanese were building airfields, they'd need fighter protection nearby. He ordered maximum ammunition loaded for every gun position. Extra armor. Prepare for combat, even though intelligence said they wouldn't see any. Old 666 took off before dawn, heading northwest toward Bougainville. Hours of flying over empty ocean. Then the northern coast appeared. Ziemer descended to begin the photo run. That's when navigator Ruby Johnston spotted something that made his blood run cold. The suspected airfield below wasn't under construction. It was operational, fully functional, and currently occupied by dozens of Japanese fighters. The Japanese airfield at Buka wasn't just operational. It was one of the most active fighter bases in the Solomon Islands. Old 666 had just flown directly over it at 8,000 feet, photographing everything intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a lightly defended reconnaissance target. This was a hornet's nest. Below them, Japanese pilots were already running toward their fighters. Mitsubishi A6M0s were starting their engines. Within minutes, Old 666 would be facing a swarm of the most maneuverable fighters in the theater, and the nearest American air support was over 600 miles away. Ziemer made instant calculations. They couldn't outrun Zeros. They couldn't outclimb them. Their only advantage was firepower and the modifications they'd made to Old 666. The extra guns, the additional ammunition, everything squadron commanders had criticized as unnecessary was about to be tested. Within 10 minutes, 17 Japanese fighters were climbing toward them. The Japanese pilots knew exactly what they were hunting. A lone reconnaissance bomber with no fighter escort, no support, and no way to escape. What they didn't know was that this particular B-17 had firepower that would surprise them, and the reckless American pilot flying it had been preparing for exactly this situation. The first Zero made its attack run from 12 o'clock high, diving toward Old 666's nose. But Ziemer had reinforced the nose compartment and added guns specifically for this scenario. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski opened fire with twin 50-caliber machine guns. The Japanese pilot, expecting minimal resistance, flew directly into concentrated fire. His rounds tore through the Zero's engine. The fighter pulled up smoking, its attack run aborted. That was when the other 16 Zeros attacked simultaneously from multiple angles. And that was when Ziemer's crew discovered what 40 minutes of continuous combat actually meant. Ziemer threw the B-17 into violent evasive maneuvers that should have been impossible for a heavy bomber. Steep banks, diving turns, altitude changes that kept the Zeros from establishing stable firing positions. Every gun position on Old 666 was firing simultaneously. The modifications meant they had more guns and more ammunition than any standard B-17. The sound inside was deafening. Guns hammering, shell casings rattling, men shouting target positions. Zeros attacked in rotating waves. Two fighters would make attack runs while the others repositioned. The Japanese pilots were experienced, coordinated, executing perfect tactical doctrine. By all calculations, Old 666 should have been shot down within 10 minutes. But the concentrated defensive fire was forcing Zeros to break off their attacks early. Multiple Japanese fighters took damage. The bomber that should have been an easy kill was fighting back with firepower that seemed impossible, and the American pilot was flying defensively in ways the Japanese had never seen from a B-17. Then the situation got worse. A Zero attack from the rear quarter hit Old 666's tail section. Hydraulic lines burst. Another Zero attack hit the bomb bay, shrapnel tearing through the fuselage. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski, firing from the nose, saw a Zero lining up for a head-on attack. He kept his guns on target even as the Zero's rounds walked up the nose of the bomber. His tracers found the Zero's engine. The Japanese fighter exploded, but the Zero's 20mm cannon rounds hit the nose compartment simultaneously. Sarnowski took shrapnel wounds to his side and legs. Despite severe wounds, Sarnowski refused to leave his gun position. More Zeros were attacking from the front. Wounded, bleeding, he continued firing. His defensive fire kept forcing Japanese fighters to break off their attacks. It was keeping the crew alive, so he stayed at his guns. Ziemer, in the pilot's seat, felt impacts slam into his legs and arms. Blood immediately started flowing. The pain was intense, but his hands stayed on the controls. Co-pilot Ruby Johnston was calling out fighter positions. They had Zeros above, below, and on both sides. The textbook said a bomber in this position was already dead. 20 minutes into the battle, every crew member aboard Old 666 had been wounded. Ziemer was flying with shrapnel in both legs and both arms. Sarnowski was severely wounded, but still firing. The gunners were injured, but maintaining defensive fire. The bomber was shredded, systems failing, and still they fought. 30 minutes in, the character of the battle changed. The Zeros had expended most of their ammunition. Several Japanese fighters had taken damage. 5 Zeros remained, determined to finish what they'd started. Sarnowski, despite catastrophic wounds, saw another Zero setting up for a nose attack. He trained his guns on the approaching fighter and fired. His rounds hit the Zero's wing root. The Japanese fighter shuddered, but kept coming, its guns flashing. The Zero's rounds tore into the nose compartment. Sarnowski was hit again, this time mortally, but his defensive fire had forced the Zero off its attack angle. The rounds that should have killed both pilots missed by inches. Sarnowski slumped over his guns. He'd stayed at his position through wounds that should have incapacitated him. His refusal to abandon his guns had saved the crew, but the cost was his life. 35 minutes after the first Zero attack, the last Japanese fighters broke off. They'd expended all ammunition, taken damage, and reached their fuel limits. Old 666 was still flying, still heading south. The bomber had survived an attack that should have been impossible to survive. But surviving the attack wasn't the same as making it home. Old 666 was 600 miles from Port Moresby, missing an engine, with severe structural damage, wounded crew, hydraulics failing, and a pilot rapidly losing blood. Ziemer's consciousness was fading in and out. Blood loss, shock, and wounds to both arms and both legs were taking their toll. Johnston kept him focused, talking constantly, helping maintain course toward Port Moresby. The bomber flew at low altitude, unable to climb with one engine damaged and hydraulics destroyed. The gunners performed triage on each other. Every man aboard was wounded. They used first aid kits meant for minor injuries to treat wounds that required surgery. Morphine was distributed. The crew worked methodically despite their injuries, because stopping meant dying. 200 miles from base, the number 3 engine quit completely. Now Old 666 was flying on 3 engines with massive battle damage. 100 miles out, Port Moresby Tower received a priority radio call. Emergency landing, multiple wounded, aircraft severely damaged. When tower operators asked how many wounded, the response stunned them. All crew members wounded, pilot and bombardier critically injured. Ziemer, barely conscious, began the approach. The landing gear wouldn't extend properly. Hydraulics were gone. Johnston manually cranked down the gear while Ziemer maintained what little control remained. The approach was unstable, the bomber weaving as Ziemer fought to maintain altitude. Old 666 crossed the threshold low and slow. The bomber hit the runway hard, bouncing, then slamming down again. It rolled straight, despite the gear damage, and finally stopped. Medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft. Ground crews counted over 180 bullet holes and cannon strikes. The tail was shredded. Wings had gaping holes. The number 3 engine was destroyed. The aircraft shouldn't have flown at all, let alone made it 600 miles back to base. Joseph Sarnoski died shortly after Old 666 landed. His wounds were too severe, but his refusal to leave his guns during the 40-minute battle had been the difference between the crew surviving and being shot down. Every man aboard knew they were alive because Sarnoski stayed at his position despite wounds that should have made him abandon it. Ziemer spent weeks in hospital recovering. The shrapnel injuries required multiple surgeries. For a time, doctors weren't certain he'd regain full use of his limbs, but he survived and eventually recovered enough to return to duty. The intelligence photographs that Old 666 brought back were exactly what 5th Air Force needed. The images revealed Japanese air strength, airfield locations, and defensive positions that intelligence hadn't known existed. A lone bomber, attacked by 17 fighters, fought continuously for 40 minutes, survived with all crew members wounded, and made it back with mission-critical intelligence. The decorations reflected the mission's significance. Joseph Sarnoski received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Jay Ziemer received the Medal of Honor for piloting the crippled aircraft home despite severe wounds. Every other crew member received the Distinguished Service Cross. Old 666's June 16, 1943 mission became the most decorated single mission in United States Army Air Force history. A crew that every squadron commander had rejected, flying an aircraft scheduled for salvage, had accomplished what no regular crew in a standard bomber had ever done. The reckless tactics, the unauthorized modifications, the aggressive flying doctrine, everything that kept Ziemer from getting a normal crew assignment had been exactly right for the situation they encountered. Squadron commanders who had refused to assign Ziemer a crew looked at the mission reports with new understanding. The pilot they'd called too reckless had made split-second decisions under fire that saved his crew. The modifications they'd prohibited had provided the firepower that kept 17 Zeros from shooting them down. Old 666 never flew again. The battle damage was too extensive, but its crew's story spread throughout the 5th Air Force and eventually across the entire Pacific Theater. The mission became case study material for bomber crews: how to survive when outnumbered, how to maintain defensive fire coordination when wounded, how aggressive tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage. Military organizations prize standardization, following orders, and maintaining doctrine. But they also create situations where people who think differently, who challenge assumptions, get rejected as difficult or reckless. Ziemer had been one of those people. Every commanding officer had looked at his file and made the same decision. Too risky, won't follow orders, can't work with normal crews. Those assessments were technically correct, but when his crew faced a situation where by-the-book flying meant certain death, his unorthodox approach saved them all. After the war, Ziemer returned to civilian life. He rarely discussed the Bougainville mission. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer, not displayed. Friends described a man who remained uncomfortable with attention, who still questioned why things were done certain ways, who never really fit into organizations that valued conformity. The crew of Old 666 stayed in contact after the war. When they gathered for reunions, they'd remember that the tactics commanders called reckless kept them alive when textbook doctrine would have failed. Today, historians recognize Old 666's mission as one of the most remarkable survival stories of the war. But the deeper significance isn't just survival. It's what that survival revealed about the tension between following doctrine and adapting to reality. Organizations need standards, but they also need people who know when to break them. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is exactly what their commanders told them not to do. Not because they're insubordinate or reckless, but because they understand the situation better than the people making the rules. Jay Zimmer was called too reckless to fly by every squadron commander in the Southwest Pacific. Then he fought 17 Zeros for 40 minutes, brought his crew home alive, and proved that sometimes recklessness is another word for being ready for reality.